Hey, welcome back. It's Sarah from Roadworthy. So this is my sketchiest outdoor location yet. Um, well, first of all, I'm holding my oh my God, what's it called? The stand, the camera's on the menopause brain. As someone told me, nouns are the first to go. Anyway, whatever that thing is, I'm holding it with my feet. Otherwise, it'll tip right over. Um, but my God, beautiful day here. So, um, what have I been up to this week? I feel like not a super ton of reading. It was my in-laws' 60th wedding anniversary this week, yesterday, in fact. And um, we had a dinner and, blah, 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 blah. I sewed a blouse for the dinner. Which got rave reviews. So I was excited about that. And now it's like, oh my God, Thanksgiving, right? And so I'm like gearing up for that. So anyway, busy time of year, but I still managed to get some books in. So I read books with a friend of mine here locally, Lori. Um, and we've been doing that since COVID. Um, And she went to the library and it was like random books on a shelf, staff recommend. So she sent me a picture, like, which one of these do you want to read? And so I selected Beyond the Sea by Paul Lynch because I thought it sounded pretty dismal. Um, so this is the story of Hector and Bolivar in a sort of unnamed South American country, but you kind of get the vibe it's Colombia. They are fishermen, and a storm is coming, but yet they decide to go to sea anyway to try and fish. Bolivar owes some money, not exactly to who or why. It's also not very clear why Hector is agreeing to go along with this, but anyway, so they head out to sea, and of course, the storm comes. They lose their engine, you know, they're lost at sea. Um, so you kind of know that sort of the horrors of starvation and dehydration are common, right? And so Lynch's descriptions of, you know, the swollen tongue sticking to the roof of your mouth, the like dry eyeballs, like it's all there. Um, but there's a big chunk that's sort of the relationship between Hector and Bolivar. And it's interesting, the I love you, man, you're my best friend, to I hate you and I want to kill you. Those extremes and how that sort of mirrors them going through periods of hope and despair as they're floating out to sea day upon day upon day. There's also a lot of philosophical musings on fate, destiny, how much is fate controlling what happens to them versus how much actual agency do they have about influencing the outcome. There's also stuff with faith and spirituality, and they at one point they make a statue of the Virgin out of garbage floating in the sea. Um, a lot of it is too, they're struggling with their own imperfections as people, right? As you are facing your own mortality, what are your regrets, right? What are you ashamed of? Hector, he's a teenager, you know, it's not clear, but I think he's like 17, 18 years old, you know, and he's sort of regretting how he treated his girlfriend, his family. Um, and Bolivar is, I think, in his late 30s, maybe. You know, he's regretting sort of his shortcomings as a father, as a husband, not so much, but as a father, and sort of choices that he made as a younger man. Um, this has a very ambiguous ending. I personally loved it. It's almost a litmus test for, you know, are you a pessimist or an optimist? um, Lori and I are both pessimists, so we didn't have tremendous disagreement about the ending of this book, but it could be really annoying for people who want clarity. I listened to Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. I am intentionally late to this booktube party. I just felt like when this book came out, everybody was reading it and there was so much hype about it. And so I wanted to wait until that died down. And I remembered the plot, but not really anything that people said about it. So it was sort of the perfect time to dive in. But this book, for those of you who don't know, um, Leah and Miri are a married couple, and Leah is an underwater scientist, and she is on a planned 3-week undersea, you know, deep ocean research trip um, that gets something happens. There's a malfunction on the ship, and she ends up under the sea for 6 months. Um, and she returns to Miri changed. You know, emotionally, she's not there. You know, physically, things happen. You know, she's changed. Um, that's the book. There's alternating points of view that I think is kind of compelling here. So you get Aaliyah's perspective, which is her relating what was happening on this undersea voyage. Um, you know, when the ship malfunctions and they're stuck, you know, what does she and the crew do? She's, you know, they're having their own psychological challenges, right? She's reminiscing about her relationship with Mary, and so you start to get their history. Um, and then those chapters are alternated with chapters from Mary's perspective. So some of those chapters, they start off as her talking about when Leah was under the water, stuck under the water. They didn't know what was happening. You know, it's the experience of her grieving the loss of Leah when there's no body. And then when Leah comes back, but is not Leah, it's her grieving when there is a body. Leah is there, but she's not there. Um, it's sort of like I imagine what it's like caring for an elderly parent or spouse who has dementia, right? Um, you know, they're there physically, but it's not the person that you knew and fell in love with. Mary goes through her own sort of complicated set of emotions, and I think Armfield really portrays this well. You know, she's angry, she's frustrated, She gets depressed. She's lonely. She's anxious. Um, for me, these chapters, for me, I really resonated with. My oldest son has some severe mental illness. Um, and I've spent a lot of this year sort of supporting him on his healing path. And a lot of Miri's feelings and what she was describing is a lot of how I felt this past year. You know, my son is there with me, but he's not the same person that he was a couple of years ago. And so I really related to um, a lot of her feelings of grief. There's definitely a horror element to this book. Um, you know, Leah starts to have physical changes, so there's definitely a body horror element here. Leah works for the center. It's never explained exactly who's the center, what's their mission, what was Leah's mission underwater. It's never clear. You know, it's hinted at. Uh, was the mission always supposed to be 6 months and sort of, but you know, the crew didn't know. I know for some readers, this horror element they really liked. For me, and again, could because I'm not a huge horror reader, I personally found these kind of distracting. Um, because again, you know, I was much more into sort of the meditations on grief. Um, you know, and therefore Leah's point of view was a little less compelling for me. Um, and to me, that the ending felt a bit obvious and sort of rushed and like it's over. um, so you know, this book was a little bit uneven for me. I think because of my personal reaction to Miri's perspective. Um, I will say, um, sort of like the last book, you know, if you need, like, I need to know exactly what happened, this will also be a very frustrating book for you. It's not exactly clear what happened to Leah. It's never like explicitly stated. And so, again, I think that that could annoy certain readers. Lastly, I read The House of Doors by Twan. This book was longlisted on this year's Booker Prize long list. And I'm not a huge prize follower, but when I saw this on the long list, it was more of a like, oh, Ang has a new book out. I didn't know. Um, he was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize a couple of years ago for his book Garden of Evening Mists, which I loved as well, and I loved this book too. This book, for those who haven't read it yet, is about Leslie and Robert, who are this Anglo couple living in Penang. This is when Malaysia is a colony of Britain. Willie, Somerset Maugham, and his secretary slash lover Gerald come to stay with them for 2 weeks. So Willie and Robert had been friends in college, so that's sort of the connection there. And so when Mom is traveling around Asia, they invite him to come stay with them, and he does. Willie and Leslie form a bond, and she shares a story from her life in 1910. Ang, if you're not familiar with Ang's writing, his writing is so lush and evocative and immersive. You know, the clothes, the food, his descriptions of Penang as this multicultural, multi-ethnic city, it's just so immersive. Right? So he talks about the Anglos, sort of, you know, out there on the periphery. Um, but you have Malays and Bengalis and Tamils and Chinese, all living in this city. So there's, you know, mosques and temples and, you know, anyway, just it sounds wonderful. And does a great job of including details or that just convey the colonialism in Malay at the time. My God, I had no idea that this particular spot would be like Grand Central Station. Anyway, as I was saying, for the third time, um, this book deals a lot with the complexities of marriage. Um, you have Leslie and Gerald's challenged relationship. Um, it's a lot of who who's chained to who in order to meet sort of societal expectations, and also, you know, what would be the implications for divorce. Leslie is well aware that if she divorces Robert, that she'll lose her children, she'll lose her social status, she'll be economically ruined. Um, you know, what's she going to do and where to go? But as the story goes on, you also realize how Robert is really just as trapped as she is, and then that also has a little bit of uh, Willie's marriage to Sylvie, and he's clearly a homosexual man, so it's their marriage, but also how that impacts his relationship with Gerald. Um, so just and you know, a lot about, you know, they all have secrets, right? And a little bit of how much truth do you share, and how do you balance telling the truth with perhaps your own happiness and your own security. So really interesting look at marriage, um, you know, at this period of time. Um, so as I mentioned, Leslie and Willie sort of form this relationship, and she tells him a story about Ethel Proudlock, who was an Englishwoman who uh, murdered an Englishman. And this is a true historical event that Mom wrote about in his short story, The Letter, that apparently was also made into a movie. Um, but you know, you really see, you know, Leslie sort of uses it to sort of illustrate, to also be sort of sharing an aspect of her life during that period, and how Ethel's story and her story are sort of parallels, and how Ethel in some ways is sort of a cautionary tale for Leslie. Um, you know, it and then, you know, it sort of got me thinking about um, a little bit of like what stories get told and how they get told, and what stories sort of get lost to history. Um, the other thing that I I liked, um, there's just this tone of melancholy, I think, through a lot of this book. And it's really Leslie's story and Leslie's voice that carries you along. And she's a very sympathetic character. You do feel badly for her situation. Um, but sort of towards the end of the book, she does eventually take responsibility for her own life and her own future and happiness. I thought the ending of this book was perfect. It made me want to read Mom again. I've read Razor's Edge and The Painted Veil, and both really liked those books. But this definitely made me want to read more. I just really, the characters are so rich. Again, everybody is a little bit sympathetic, but they're all very complicated. They're not perfect people by any stretch of the imagination, but anyway, it was wonderful, 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 wonderful. Loved it. Texted my mother right away to say you'd love this book. um, so anyway, that's what I've read this week, and next week is Thanksgiving, so I will be out of town, hoping to be able to film, but we'll see. See ya.